Hello everyone, in this episode of Motive Tech, we are talking about intakes, what makes them work and more importantly, not work. Now, the online arguments about intake kits and the real-world effectiveness versus the manufacturer's claims never end. We've heard it all before. Manufacturers telling us that they can get a 5, 10, 15, 20, even 30 horsepower increase from an intake kit, and then someone goes and tests it and they find that they didn't get that. Now, in this video, we're not going to try and call out an individual manufacturer or an individual kit and try and discredit it. What we want to do is talk about the theory behind why an intake works. Now, we're not going to talk about inlet manifolds or inlet runners or throttle bodies because there is a lot of science behind what happens after the throttle body. In fact, there is so much science of what happens after the throttle body that we could do 100 tech videos about inlet manifold design, talk about inlet runner lengths and bell mouths and the angle to the ports and all sorts of stuff. All we're going to talk about is what happens in the intake, which is everything that happens before the throttle body on a naturally aspirated car, or everything that happens leading up to the compressor wheel on a turbocharged car, because the theory behind this stuff is relatively straightforward, and also, well, that's the only bit the intake kit actually replaces. So there is 3 things to look at when it comes to an intake: the restriction, or lack thereof, the air temperature, and the airflow meter signal or the manipulation of that signal. Now, some people will say that you need to talk about the smoothness of the flow, but to be honest, in a lot of intakes, the turbulent air or the smoothness of the flow is actually quite inconsequential, but really, it's actually related back to restriction. Now, when it comes to restriction, if you put a vacuum sensor in the intake, it will tell you what's going on with the restriction. If you have zero vacuum or very close to zero vacuum, then there is no restriction in the intake. The end, video finished. However, if there is vacuum inside the intake, then there is a restriction somewhere. Now, a lot of people that make intakes or a lot of people that test them, they don't do that. They just change the intake and see what happens. But this is probably the most important data that you could use to find out whether your intake is working correctly or not. In fact, there's a lot of videos on the internet where people have put an intake onto a flow bench, they've put a vacuum sensor on the intake, and they basically measure the change in vacuum as they go from no filter to cone filter or to all sorts of different filters, and you can see the vacuum changing. Basically, if there is no vacuum or very close to no vacuum, then there is no restriction in the intake on full throttle when you're driving the car. So when it comes to that restriction, what you also have to remember is it will change as you modify the car. So if the car has zero restriction, well, as you increase the power of the car, that restriction should stay at zero. However, at some point, something in the intake might become a restriction, whether that's the air filter or if you high flowed the turbo, maybe one part of the intake. So you might have no change in restriction as power increases, and all of a sudden, way more restriction later on. Now, if you start with a bit of restriction already in the factory intake, basically as you start modifying the car and increasing the power, the restriction will just increase with power. What rate will it increase? Well, that's different for every car. I cannot draw one graph to suit every car. But what that means really is that if you had a 5 horsepower restriction in a standard car and you put on an exhaust, intercooler, increase the boost, that 5 horsepower actually could become 20 horsepower. So testing an intake on a standard car versus testing an intake on a modified car can have very different results. So if someone tells you their intake can make 30 more horsepower, yeah, sure, maybe on a car that has an aftermarket exhaust, intercooler and more boost, but it might only make 2 horsepower difference on a standard car. So that's another thing you need to consider when looking at an intake. So that restriction can change based on the power level and what's going on. But one of the biggest things that changes as power goes up is actually the air filter. So you might find no difference in power, then all of a sudden on 25 pounder boost, you have a restriction that starts to massively go up. Now, a lot of factory intakes these days don't have a whole lot of restriction, especially in factory trim, which is why a lot of intakes don't really do a whole lot. But people will tell you things like these corrugated rubber tubes are turbulent and restrictive, or, you know, the bend in the factory bit or the resonator inside is turbulent and causes restriction. But before we talk about the restriction in the intake itself, I want to talk about the actual turbocharger and the sizing of the pipe to do with that. Now, if we take a GR Yaris as an example, because obviously we've worked on one, and we look at the turbocharger, the opening to the turbocharger is 51 millimeters. But that actually gets even smaller as it comes down to the compressor wheel. The compressor wheel itself, the inducer, is only 42.5 millimeters in diameter. So 42.5 at the face of the blade, then becomes 51 millimeters at the opening of the turbo, and then you have this turbo elbow, which no one changes, and then it is 76 millimeters where it joins to the intake. So every intake kit, the 76 down to 51 is kind of irrelevant. It's all about what happens up until that 76. Now, we got out the verniers and we measured all of this, and it's 76, and then it's 76 at the end, and the smallest it gets is 75 millimeters on the smallest part of diameter of the corrugated part of the intake tube, and at the airflow meter, it's also 75 millimeters. So the entire system is 75, 75, 76, 76, and then down to 51. Is there really going to be a whole lot of restriction in the intake piping on a GR Yaris? Well, an educated guess to me says no. But then someone's going to tell you, what about all the turbulent flow happening inside the pipes? Well, turbulent flow usually arises because it can't flow smoothly along the edge, and that separates from what should be a boundary layer of air along the edge or the surface of the pipe. Now, even if you had a massive 10 millimeter of turbulent air along the inside of the pipe in every direction, you take 10 millimeters off 75, you've still got 65 millimeters. Even take 20 millimeters off, and you've still got 55 millimeters of smooth air in the middle going to a 51 millimeter opening to the turbocharger. So there is still plenty of flow, even if it's turbulent. But let's look at what causes some of that turbulence, shall we? Here's a couple of bits of reasons why you might get turbulent air on an intake. The first one is the whole bell mouth versus open pipe. Basically, if an open pipe is sucking air in, the air that comes in from close to 90 degrees or perpendicular to the pipe, as it hits the edge of the pipe, the airflow separates and starts to create a layer of turbulence, and the rest of the air has to flow around that turbulence and then keep going. So essentially, as the air comes in, it's kind of squeezed in the throat here, and you're effectively narrowing that pipe or the smooth part of that pipe, so it actually reduces the amount of flow. When you put a bell mouth on the end of a pipe, which a lot of air filters have built into the inside, the air coming in perpendicular, because it's been sucked into this pipe, as it flows around the edge, the flow stays smooth and you have good flow. There are actually videos on the internet that show that a bell mouth or an air filter with a bell mouth versus straight pipe, the straight pipe actually flows less. Now let's talk about bends. When you have a mandrel bend, if the boundary layer of air on the surface, if it can stay attached, then you have smooth flow. The only thing restricting the flow is literally the friction of the air on the surface. But when you have a sharp bend like this, same sort of deal, the air as it goes around that corner, the boundary layer separates off the edge of that point, you get some turbulence here, and then the smooth air is kind of forced to go up and over that turbulence, and you're basically choking that intake part of the pipe there and effectively making it smaller. So that's how turbulence is created. Now, sometimes this turbulence can get pretty violent, but like I said, most of the turbulence created in an intake happens around the actual surface of the pipe, while the air flowing through the middle of the pipe will stay smooth. So the more turbulent, I guess, the more it will choke down the pipe artificially. Essentially, the turbulence becomes a restriction to the pipe, which is why I said the turbulence links back to the restriction in the intake. So the next thing to talk about is the effect of turbulent air on a turbocharger. Now, if you think about a radiator and the fan on the radiator, it doesn't matter if it's on the front or the back, it either pushes or pulls. Now, if you can imagine a fan on the back of a radiator, it just pulls the air through the radiator. Well, as you know, a turbocharger obviously sucks air into it. And sucking air in is the same as blowing air through, pretty much. So what happens is you can have all this turbulence happening on the intake of a turbo, but because it's forcing it in, as it sort of gets to the mouth of the turbo, the air will just be forced to go straight and smooth. So all of this turbulence happening upstream of the turbo doesn't really affect how it goes into the turbo itself. Like I said though, this turbulence can create some restriction, but as it gets into the turbo itself, it just sucks the air straight and goes into the turbo. So you don't have to worry about that turbulence affecting the turbo. Now, people have debunked in plenty of other videos that it doesn't really matter how the air hits the turbo. It can come in dead straight, can come in on a bit of an angle. Some people have the turbo half hanging out of the bonnet, the other half in the bonnet. So therefore you've got fast air over the bonnet hitting it flat out, but the other half's from the engine. But the turbo doesn't care. It just spins and brings air in. What you need to remember is the wheel is spinning at 100, 150, 200,000 RPM, depending on the turbo. So you can imagine the speed that it's spinning that way versus the speed of the air coming this way. It's almost inconsequential, the speed or the angle that the air coming in is hitting that turbocharger. We're talking the most minute variances. Now, if you want to put that into a real-world example that you can understand, think about flying in a jet aeroplane. They have a big, giant spinning compressor wheel on the engine as you fly through the air at 700, 800, 900 kilometres per hour. So they're going pretty fast in terms of the air being forced into that. Now, you can see that when they're on the ground and it's raining, or they're near the ground and have the actual surface of the earth affecting the way the air flows into that engine, or when they're flying through the air and they hit a giant bit of turbulence. Have you ever noticed a jet engine change the amount of power output? Have you ever felt an aircraft stall and go slower because it hit a turbulent pocket of air? No, it doesn't care. It just sucks the air in and forces it in there to do its job. The only time forcing the air in is a problem, obviously, is if there is an actual restriction. The turbulence or the direction of air barely matters on a turbocharged car. Now, turbulent air versus smooth flowing air doesn't really affect a turbocharger too much, but it can affect a naturally aspirated car. But it all depends on the design of the inlet manifold, the size and location and angle of the throttle body. There is a lot of science behind how much it will affect a naturally aspirated car of smooth versus turbulent flow. But overall, restriction will always affect every engine. Now, what that also means is on a turbocharged car, there are some circumstances where smooth airflow versus turbulent airflow can actually help it come on boost a little bit quicker. And that's just got more to do with the inertia of air getting from the air filter or the outside air, getting to the engine smoothly and as quickly as possible. But once you're kind of on boost, it doesn't really matter. So there are some circumstances where smooth air can make some very small gains on a turbocharged car. Now, once you move the turbocharger, things change dramatically. Think about all those big single turbos on a GTR that move the turbo altogether, which obviously means you're going to do a custom intake, and we're not going to talk about that because that's a whole nother video. However, the theory behind what we're talking about still applies to a custom intake. But when you do a high flow turbo, for example, in the factory position, the factory intake that maybe wasn't restrictive on a stock turbo, that could become a restriction on a high flow turbo. So things change again. Now, one of the biggest factors when it comes to restriction on the intake can be the air filter. Now, sometimes you may have perfectly good piping to the turbo, but the actual air filter is the restriction. Now, we have tested numerous times factory paper air filters versus high performance panel filters such as the ones from K&N. And the internet arguments will start right now about whether they're worth it. Now, here's the thing. It depends on the application. Now, if you're only trying to suck 100 horsepower through this, it might not have any restriction whatsoever. But what about when you try and put 250 horsepower through it? And that's the point. You don't know at what point an air filter becomes a restriction unless you try it. So some factory cars change to a K&N panel filter and pick up 1 horsepower, while other cars change from factory paper to a K&N panel filter and pick up 10 horsepower. It really does depend on the car and application. But just remember this, the restriction when it's stock will amplify as it makes more power. So back to the graph. If you start off with, say, a 2 horsepower difference from paper filter to performance filter down low and you say, that's not worth the money, what happens then when you add camshafts or turn up the boost, add an exhaust and turn the power up? That restriction will mean that you have a bigger power drop the more power that you're trying to make. So at 200 horsepower, there might be a 2 horsepower difference, but at 250 horsepower, that could be a 10 horsepower difference. And that's the thing, you don't know what it's going to do until you actually test it in that exact model of car with that exact intake. But is there benefits going from paper over to something like a K&N? Depends on your car, depends on your application. In a dead stock Toyota GR Yaris, is there really any benefit? Not really, but here's the other thing. You can clean these, well, these generally get filthy and you have to throw them away. So there's that part to look at as well. But once again, it always depends on the application and what you've done to the car to work out how much difference that filter is going to make. So now let's look at a couple of real-world examples about the restrictions of air filters. We'll go big first, our R32 GTR. Now, the last time we dynoed that car and we're trying to push towards 900 horsepower, we found that anywhere up until about 700 horsepower, the K&N pod filter that we had on the intake didn't really make any difference whether it was on the car or off the car. But as we went past 700 wheel horsepower, it started to make a significant difference in the amount of power the car could make. We pulled the air filter off just below 800 horsepower, and we found that back to back, we picked up nearly 50 horsepower difference from having a filter or no filter with a bell mouth. And back to what we said with the graph, sometimes it makes no difference, no difference, no difference. And all of a sudden you get to a power level where that filter is now a restriction, and obviously that restriction starts to increase pretty quickly as you turn the power up even further. Now, another real world example is our Toyota GR Yaris. We recently fitted an intake kit to that car from All Type Fabrication. Now, it replaced the middle pipe with a dead straight piece of pipe that then had a perfect mandrel bend on it and smoothed out anything from factory and got rid of the resonators. It also got rid of the corrugated section of the intake and was dead smooth through to the airflow meter section, and then had a big 5-inch bell mouth with a massive filter on it, and we also took out the airflow meter. So we did everything right to get rid of any potential restriction in the intake. I don't think we literally could have done it any better than what we did. Now, we also looked at the intake air temperatures to make sure they were pretty much the same as before, and they were, because the factory air intake to a Yaris is pretty terrible for ingesting hot air, and our intake kit also had all the sealed off sections so that the air through the front grille went in there. So what happened? Well, the very first dyno run, 0 difference. The second dyno run, 0 difference. The third dyno run, maybe about 3 or 4 horsepower increase over what we had before. Now, bear in mind, our Yaris is running 28 pounder boost and making 70 horsepower more than factory. So if there is any restriction in the intake, we were going to find it by running all that extra boost and extra power. And basically, well, we barely found any difference at all. That last 3 horsepower could just be inconsistency on the dyno. Same went with our GR Supra. We had a very small gain in power by putting in a K&N panel filter, but when we changed the actual intake pipe from the airbox to the turbo and changed all the resonators and all that sort of stuff, we had 0 change in horsepower on that car as well. So a lot of factory intakes are actually pretty good. So the next thing to talk about on intakes is air temperature. This is quite a simple theory. The colder the air is going into the engine, the denser the air is, which means it has more oxygen molecules inside a volume of air. Therefore, you can add more fuel. Therefore, you can make more power. How much more power? Well, that depends on the car, really. It could be anywhere from 1 horsepower to 50 or 60 horsepower, depending on the capacity and just how modified that engine is and what it's doing. But here's the thing, naturally aspirated cars do benefit directly from how cold the intake air is. Basically what that means is the colder the air, the more power it makes. And it's usually pretty noticeable and quite measurable. Now, when it comes to air temperature affecting a turbocharged car, it's actually a little bit different and doesn't work the way that you think it will. And I'll try and explain this very simply. Let's just say you've got 20 degrees of intake air temperature coming into the air filter and into the turbocharger. Now, when it comes out of the turbocharger, it could be as high as, say, 130 degrees. Now, if you have a really good intercooler, that 130 could come back down to, say, let's say 35 degrees. So now you've got 35 degrees intake air temperature going into the engine. Now, if that 20 degrees coming into the air filter, because you've got a really crappy intake kit, is now 30 degrees, the way turbochargers work, it doesn't necessarily mean that that extra 10 degrees will become 140 at the other end. It might only go to 135. Now, if your intercooler is good enough and has enough efficiency in it, it could still actually drop the intake air temperature down to, say, 36 degrees. So even though there's a 10 degree intake difference here and a 5 degree difference here, there might only be a 1 degree difference when it goes into the engine itself. Now, here's the best part, talking about a cold night and making more power in your car. People think that on a cold night, your turbo car's making all this extra power because you've got nice cold air into the engine. The real reason it's probably going so well is you have nice cold air hitting your intercooler. So the intake air temp that was going from 130 down to 35, that's probably now going from 130 down to, say, 20. So you're getting a much bigger increase in performance from lowering the intake air temperature via the intercooler. So what does this mean? Well, you could have a terrible intake into your turbo car, and we've seen a lot of that. People that have no air filter, they literally just suck hot engine bay air that could be 80 or 90 degrees. But the thing is, by the time it goes through the intercooler and has nice cold air hit that intercooler, the intake air temperatures are actually still pretty good. So the intercooler is often doing more work than what the actual cold air intake is. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't try and have a cold air intake? Of course not. The colder you can get the air going in, you are going to get the gains going into the engine. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, it just means that it doesn't make as big a difference as you probably think it will. But there is one big difference it does make, and that's when you're doing normal city driving. What actually happens is if you have a turbo sucking in hot engine bay air, like a lot of GTR owners do, that hot engine bay air that's going through the system, when it gets to the air temperature sensor up here before the throttle body, that can get to like 70, 80 degrees intake air temp. And what then happens is the engine pulls a lot of timing out and the car actually feels really sluggish when you first take off. It's not till you actually get air moving again and the intercooler does its job that you then get that air back down to where it should be. So the intake air temperature on a turbocharged car actually matters more when you're idling or driving slowly. So if you're getting 30 degree air versus 20 degree air on the intake through a turbo, but no air is going through the intercooler, well then guess what? There is a big difference in air temperature at the throttle body. So it really all depends on what you're doing with the car. A cold air intake will massively benefit a car that's daily driven and driven around town and things like that. And that's why we've seen a lot of benefits with the motive headlight duct. A lot of GTR owners who have a big turbo on their GTR will say, man, when I'm driving on the street, it feels really sluggish. And that's because their intake air temperature has creeped up to 70, 80 or 90 degrees, and it doesn't come back down until you start getting airflow back through the intercooler and airflow starting to cool things back down again. And it takes time for that intake air temp to come back down. So the motive headlight duct puts cool air onto the filter and they're finding that those intake air temps will come back down really quickly once they start moving, which means they don't have that sort of sluggish performance or that initial takeoff that's really doughy. So intake air temperatures do matter on a turbocharged car, or a cold air intake can make a lot of difference, but it makes more of a difference when you're not actually moving or you're doing city driving. So on a drag car or a circuit car, it may not make as much of a difference as you think, but it will help your street car. So let's look at a couple of real world examples when it comes to intake air temperature. The first one, our GR Yaris, has two intakes into the airbox. The top permanent one that's open and then a bottom one that only opens up under higher RPM or under more boost. So the intake that goes into the airbox, which is fed from the front grille, is not sealed. Has holes in the side, holes in the back. So what does that mean? Well, the intake itself doesn't really get a whole lot of cold air to it, and it can suck hot air in from the engine bay in through the back of this. And also, when this bottom flap opens up, what does it do? It sucks hot air from directly behind the radiator. So what can you do with the GR Yaris? Well, you want to get actual cold air from outside the car into these intakes into the airbox. Now, one way to do that is replace the factory intake with a sealed one. So that goes in here and is now putting actual fresh air from in front of the car through the grille into the actual airbox itself. Now, here's a little interesting thing that can happen. Because that is being fed direct air from in front of the car, what happens is even when this bottom flap opens, most of the air is actually still coming in through the front vent because that air is being forced in at speed. And if there's any more air than what the engine needs, it'll actually try and push back out the bottom flap and push the hot air back out. So even just changing this part of the intake pipe can make a lot of benefits. But a lot of other Yaris owners have put a cold air duct directly to this bottom flap. Now, it is very hard to try and read that on the dyno. You might only see 1 horsepower difference on the dyno, but guys who have done this modification have gone out on the track and experienced 1 or 2 tenths quicker lap times or even 1 mile an hour down the drag strip. So the cold air into the factory airbox is making a difference in the real world, and they said they can feel it as well, but do you measure it on the dyno? Not always. Now, another real world example of a cold air intake, but this time going backwards, was the one that we fitted to our Porsche 997. Now, the manufacturer claimed an increase of over 20 horsepower at certain parts of the rev range and about 10 horsepower peak up top, but we actually experienced a 10 horsepower decrease everywhere. Now, a lot of cold air intake kits come with shielding and little rubber seals and things like that, But if they're not truly sealed up and only getting cold air from outside the car and none from the engine bay, then they can't really be called a cold air intake, can they? They're just an intake. So even with all those shields, with all the little gaps in them, you're still getting hot air from the engine bay leaking into where the intake is. And the Porsche 997 kit was a perfect example of that. The factory airbox and its snorkel was sealed up to the deck lid and only sucked in cold air. But the cold air intake kit that we installed on the car, even though it had some shields, heaps of ambient air, especially the hot stuff from behind the engine, could make its way into the intake. And what we noticed on the dyno is we had 6-degree increase in intake air temperature at higher RPM. That's 20% increase in air temp. So not only is the air now less dense and make less power, the ECU saw this and it pulled ignition timing out as well, making even less power. Now on top of all of that, another thing we noticed with that Porsche intake kit was that we had a much richer air-fuel ratio, which not only happened due to the air being less dense, but also the fact that the airflow meter signal had been changed from factory, which leads us to our final thing to talk about with intakes, and that is the airflow meter signal and the manipulation of this signal. Now, firstly, let's talk about how these mass airflow meters work. Now, there's a whole bunch of different designs and the way the air flows through them is all different, but essentially there is a wire inside that is heated up obviously by electrical current, and as the air flows over it, it cools the wire down, and basically what we're measuring is how much current is required to keep that wire heated. And obviously the more current means the more airflow, and then the calibration of all of that information is sent as a signal to the ECU based on how much airflow there is. Now the thing you have to remember is this airflow meter sits inside a pipe as such. So the calibration of this airflow meter is not only based off the design of the airflow meter itself, it's also based on the size of the pipe that it's sitting in. So if it sits in there like that, you can see how big that pipe is part of the calibration of how much air is flowing past that airflow meter. So I'll show you this. Pipe, bigger pipe, and bigger pipe. Now, if you can imagine that same airflow meter is calibrated to be in a pipe that big, that means all of the air flowing through there, when it measures it, is based on how much air flows through here. Now, if you go and put that airflow meter in a smaller pipe, what are you doing? Well, the signal from the airflow meter is the same, but the actual amount of air going into the engine is totally different. Same when you go to a bigger one. So when you change the piping size of an intake with an airflow meter, it's actually changing the signal from that airflow meter to the ECU. Now, what will that do? Well, it might try and change the tune of the car. Now, older ECUs especially, if you change that, it will change the air-fuel ratio of the car. It may even change ignition timing based on that air-fuel ratio and totally change it. Now, it could be worse. Sometimes it's actually better. I've seen cold air intakes manipulate the airflow meter signal, make the car run just that little bit leaner and actually pick up like 10, 15 horsepower. So it wasn't actually the intake making the power, it's tuning just done by default by manipulating the airflow meter signal. Now, some intakes will tell you that if you install it, you have to recalibrate the airflow meter and retune the car, which is fair enough. But you don't have this problem when you have an aftermarket ECU, do you? So that's one good thing about tuning a car with an aftermarket ECU is you go off a map sensor, you don't have to worry about that. So some intakes that claim they make more power by freeing up the intake, they're actually not. They're just manipulating the signal for this airflow meter because they've changed the pipe size. Now, another thing that can affect the airflow meter is actually how smooth the air is onto the airflow meter. Inside the factory airbox from Toyota, there is a bell mouth. There's a little guide in here to help make it straight. And there are other cars that actually have vanes before the airflow meter to straighten the air up and make sure it hits the airflow meter dead on. Now, if you change the flow into that part of the intake, so around the airflow meter, you can change the direction of the air hitting the airflow meter, or it becomes turbulent. You can also disrupt the signal into the airflow meter, and then you get the wrong signal to your ECU, and it changes what the car is doing. So you have to be very careful when it comes to intakes. What's actually happening with this has a lot to do with what happens with the power of your engine. So in summary, what's the verdict? Well, there really isn't one. Why? Every car, every factory intake system, and every aftermarket intake system combination is unique. You really don't know until you try it on each individual car. Just because a cold air intake kit of a certain design didn't work on one car doesn't mean it will or won't work on another car. Our aim with this video wasn't so much to help you choose a particular brand of intake or style of intake, it was just to give you the knowledge that you need to help you ask the right questions and do the research to get the right intake for your car, or in the case of a highly modified car, have a custom intake made correctly.